The kingdom is at peace after a long time. David's built himself this palace of cedar wood, the cedars of Lebanon, and he has used that to build this beautiful place there in Jerusalem. He's decides as he's probably staring out of his bedroom window one evening as the sun is setting over the Mediterranean, he looks down and he sees the tabernacle and the Ark of the Covenant down there below him somewhere, and decides that God needs a better place to live than just in a tent. But this wasn't an ordinary tent. It was a movable shelter. It was a tabernacle that housed the Ark of the Covenant. Remember the movie, Raiders of the Lost Ark? Okay, you got an idea of what it looks like. It was a stone and wooden box in which were stored the 2 tablets on which were written the 10 Commandments. The portability of the tabernacle, the whole tent that the Ark was sitting in, the portability of that meant that it could move when and where God said to move. It might have been to bless a battle that was forthcoming, so we'll take the tabernacle to that place. It might have been just a sojourn to the next place that was in Israel's journey and set up there until they needed to move again to the next place. After finally uniting the kingdom and building Jerusalem, taking it away from the Jebusites, and building his own castle, his own house there, David thinks that it's time, maybe in a moment of pathos, looking out and feeling sorry for God, that David announces to the prophet Nathan. Most kings had a prophet that was associated with them. Nathan was his. Announces his intention to build a real temple for the Lord, not just this little tent, a more permanent place for God to reside. Building the temple does 2 things for David, neither of which are his finest idea. First, it legitimates his rule. Think of a realtor's mantra: location, location, location. Bill got a house. David lives in the palace next door to God. Who wouldn't want that? Wake up every morning with the creator of the universe as your neighbor. Holy smokes. Nothing could be finer. Sure, the palace receptionist would answer the phone with, "It's a great day in Jerusalem." Having God next door unites the fractured kingdom. It was united, but it was tentative. It was being held together by threads. But having God in a temple next door to the palace, that would unite everything really well. It would give Israel, the whole nation, a reason to live together in peace. And after a number of battles, David desired nothing else but peace for this shaky, but unified kingdom. So the first thing it does, it legitimates David's rule to build God this temple. The second thing that a temple does is it removes any fear that David may have that God might leave. If God has a permanent residence, chances are pretty good God's going to stay in that residence. Build God a nice enough palace, and God will stay put. And that also goes back to point number 1. It legitimates David's rule and gives him a sense of lasting peace in the country. At least the battles that come along will be victorious, and they'll garner him praise and maybe even a larger kingdom, more property around him. Political shenanigans have been around for a long time. Think about the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. God and the world's political power brokers just up the street. What a great way to legitimize the political party in power and to politicize the faith that they think they have. Hey, you Samaritans over there, we have the real God over here. So David, humbly, if in some conniving way, makes this offer. Let me build you a house, God. I'm over here in these cedar planked rooms. Let me build you something like that. Sounds plausible enough, but in this wonderful story, in this turn of events, God refuses the new house outright. It seems that God is okay living in a tent. And if you think about it, that was okay. The Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle in which it sat were symbols of God's freedom and mobility. There were no permanent standing walls to impede God's coming and going across the world. And it was mobile enough to be moved to areas of need when necessary. And perhaps most importantly, there were no social or political orders that could dictate God's whereabouts, or whose side God would be on, or who could claim God's will for the actions that they take. In its mobility, God would continue to be free. That tent, that tabernacle, was fine. Thank you very much. Now, how could God refuse this great offer? By the way, Bob Jones University in Greenville has a wonderful scale model of the tabernacle made out of wood. A former alumni built that, I think. And it's about 8 feet by 4 feet wide. And it's in their museum, in their art museum. So if you're ever over that way and have a chance to drop by and visit with it, please do. It's a marvelous little layout of the tabernacle and all of its finery. Why do you think God refused David's offer? The refusal wasn't some kind of divine disfavor with David. In fact, it was just the opposite. God really liked David and what David was doing. God wasn't displeased with the offer, nor with David. And I kind of think it was kind of a thanks, but not just now kind of response. Thank you, but not right now. In fact, later on, after blessing Israel and blessing their future, David dies. David's son Solomon builds a temple in Jerusalem for worship and for sacrifice. I think it was a teaching moment for David, in case the people were to get too comfortable with any new structures, in case they were to place too much importance on the building, as if to say, God resides here with us, not over there where you are. You come here and worship our God. It was also a reminder to David who God is. Verses 8 and 9 are particularly important, I think. I took you from the pasture. I have been with you. I have cut you off from your enemies. All those were past tense verbs. Back here in our past, David, I did these things for you. Because God and David have a history together. They have a history, and God reminds David of that gracious history in case he's forgotten. And it started back in the pasture lands of David's father, Jesse. And it continued in David being chosen as the new king, appointed by the prophet Samuel. It was a history that had been steeled and forged in the heats of battle over time and time again. Battles that were won because of God's favor. God's word here is kind of a remember when, David? Remember when I took you out of the pasture? Remember when I made you king? Remember when you won that battle? God's asking David to remember and take in that history, all of that history in which God and David had this intersection together. I can picture David mumbling a quiet, "Oh, yeah, I remember all that." I want to ask you this morning to think about your remembering that moment in your life. That moment when you were struggling to find meaning and direction in your life. The moment when the company that you'd given your life to suddenly downsized you. When the spouse walked out and never came back. When the last child left for college and you felt roomless in your house. When the cancer came back for the second time. Remember how I was there, God says. Remember and look back and see how I was with you in all of those times of your life. And even before those times in your life, I was there. Even though it might not have seemed like it was there, I was there. Even in our history here, Seneca Presbyterian Church, God was here. For 150 years, God has been here. I've nosed around in session minutes and other documents that I've found, and I've asked a few folks in town about the church. "Oh, yeah," a couple of them said. "That's the church that can't keep a pastor." Here's what I want you to hear about this text. God didn't leave David there only to remember his past. But in the next verses, God reminds David of his future. "I will build a house for you. I will make a name for you. I will give my church a people and a place to minister." If it's on the corner of Oak Street and First Street, Seneca. It's the story of David, but it's also our story. It's about taking that necessary risk of deep faith, a faith that relies on the free promise of God's grace to us all, not fame, not money, not political wins, your prior upward mobility that guarantees your place or your social status in town. None of that. It's all about God and God's grace. 25 years ago in my previous church in Simpsonville, we started planning for a new building. We were running out of space in our little sanctuary. And I kept saying that we're not building a building because a building was only a tool for ministry. But we were building a church. We weren't building a building. We were building a church. That idea, which became a mantra for me for the next 18 months or so in that process, comes from this text. That because of God's past and God's present with us now and God's future with us in our future, all of that is assured. God's presence with us now and God's presence with us in our future is assured by God's grace. We Presbyterians call it God's sovereignty, even for God to say, "No, not just yet." Church of Jesus Christ has been building a church here since resurrection, from the foundations of time. Foundations of years of hopes and dreams. Foundations on this corner of successes and failures, of joys and pains and anxious moments. And yet God has never abandoned this church. It is full of God's grace, God's never-ending grace. So much so that the prophet of Isaiah could write long after David had been put in the grave, "A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse," David, and a righteous branch will grow out of it. The Spirit of the Lord will rest upon him. The Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. Never-ending grace from a God who is free to roam. With no apologies at all to those who have stolen and misused the word, this is what it means to be evangelical. A shared faith. And we're called to tell it to the nations, as the old hymn says. And we're called to tell it until Christ's great kingdom will come to your earth, a kingdom of love and light. In Seneca Presbyterian Church, we are a part of that kingdom today. And God is free to roam in our midst and free to lead us in places that we might not be able to discern yet. The pastor nominating committee is about that work of discerning our next pastor. We're about discerning the next few months of ministry here in this place as we continue to move forward, confident that God is moving with us in those places. God is a part of it all and calls each of us to join together in ministry, from the oldest to the youngest, from the longest tenured member to the curious who just stopped by here this morning. My friend Alan Brim says that from the very beginning, God has been fully present to everyone and everything in this world. And just like at the beginning, God is still with us, because the Spirit of God, as it did at the beginning of time, still hovers and resonates over and around us all. It doesn't take a building, although this is a beautiful place. Just willing and committed and trusting souls to work for the justice and the peace of God's kingdom here on earth. For those who have ears to hear this morning, hear. Amen.